Slavery was an ever-present phenomenon in the ancient Roman Empire. It played an essential role in society, and enslaved people were an important part of the economy. These enslaved people were so prominent in numbers that Romans did not see slavery as something uncommon or unjust. Male and female slaves were sold and bought like cattle. There were different classes of slaves in the ancient Roman Empire. These slaves were bought, sold, tortured, and even killed in extreme cases for the sake of enjoyment. This inhumane treatment made the lives of all slaves miserable. But what is the history of slaves in ancient Rome? How were people enslaved, and how did their masters and the centralized government treat them? Slavery as an accepted reality. In the ancient Roman Empire, slavery was so deeply rooted in the culture that people didn't think it was anything unusual. Freedom was not considered a birthright. Instead, it was regarded as a selected privilege. Furthermore, it was said that the freedom of one class of people was only possible because the other class was enslaved. Power and inequality were crucial parts of society. Slavery was considered a necessary practice for Romans, as it was not thought of as something evil. The number of slaves was viewed as a sign of wealth, so the more, the better. Rich people are even said to have up to 400 slaves at a time. Nevertheless, it was also common for poor people to have a certain number of slaves. People enslaved. Converting war captives into slaves was the most common method of acquiring Roman slaves. Most of the time, wars produced tens of thousands or more new slaves for the nation. Naturally, the majority of Roman slaves were Greek, because the majority of wars were fought with Greece. The initial extraordinary deluge of Greek slaves into Rome happened when the Macedonians were crushed at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE. Then, around 250,000 Carthaginians were oppressed in 146 BCE when their city was demolished. After the Mithridatic Wars in the 80s BCE, another large influx occurred. None of these wars could surpass Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul in the 50s BCE, when approximately 500,000 Gauls were enslaved. These numbers are much higher than they have ever been before. However, Rome still required more slaves. Slaves also originated within Rome's borders, predominantly from slave families. Any slave woman's child, regardless of the father, was considered a slave by the Romans. Children who were exposed were also a source of slaves. However, it was not unlawful until late in the realm. Infant exposure was considered ethically suspect. The intention was death when a child was exposed. However, some children were saved by slavers by being taken in. This was an act of mercy by the slavers. However, the life they gave to the child was of a slave. People could also become Roman slaves through the enslavement of violent criminals. They would typically be trained to be gladiators or work in mines or quarries. Mining has always been one of the most difficult jobs, but it was much worse in the ancient world. Even if a criminal was sentenced to death, he would work as a slave until his time came. The Vernae, who were born in the house and were raised by Roman families, were the next class of slaves. Last but not least, Romans struggling financially could sell themselves into slavery to survive. This was yet another method by which Romans could be sold into slavery. However, by the 1st century AD, this final method had lost some of its popularity. However, the slave industry still remained popular. The infamous slave industry of the ancient Roman Empire. The Romans were born with the right to own slaves, and there was no limit to this right. They could number in the hundreds for the wealthy. For instance, the prefect of Rome under King Nero, Pedanius Secundus, owned at least 400 slaves in his townhouse. It's possible that only the senators had around 200,000, so the number of free people and slaves is easily comparable. The appearance, age, education, and ethnicity of a slave affected how much they cost. Standing half nude with a wooden sign around their necks, slaves were common sights in Roman markets. A wooden sign with all the pertinent information about a specific slave was displayed on every male, female, and child. Name, age, abilities, or other requirements were written down. At the point when a slave was sold, the law expected specific rules to be followed. If the slave's ability to perform was diminished, one of these was that the seller should declare whether the slave was ill or defective in any way. Because disagreements frequently arose regarding the performance of slaves, jurists were frequently required to rule and determine what constituted a disease or defect. A large number of Roman slaves demonstrates how successful the slave trade was. It was a very tightly controlled market that followed the best practices of Roman bureaucracy. There was a tax on purchasing slaves, and a record of every deal must be kept in public documents. In addition, the buyer was required to receive a full refund if they discovered a problem in a newly purchased slave, such as epilepsy, and the vendor did not mention it at the time of purchase. Because they were smart, Greek slaves were the most common and popular, but none of the slaves enjoyed a respectable or high social status. The status of enslaved people in the empire. Slaves constituted the lowest social class, and even freed criminals enjoyed greater rights. In point of fact, slaves lacked any legal status or individuality at all, let alone any rights. They were unable to establish relationships, have families, or own property. Like any other piece of property, a building, a chair, or a vase, they were essentially the property of a single owner. The only difference was that they could speak. During the Saturnalia festival, equality was somewhat closely achieved in Roman society, as slaves were given freedom and the rights they were usually denied. However, that freedom lasted just for a few days. Slaves were a status symbol for many of the Roman elite. Consequently, the more one had and the more exotic it was, the better. As a result, wealthy Romans frequently made public appearances, accompanied by an entourage consisting of as many as 15 slaves. Role of enslaved people in ancient Rome. Except for public office, slave labor was used in all aspects of Roman life. In addition, employers utilized whatever human resources were available and required to complete a task, so slaves and free labor were frequently combined. Slaves and laborers would collaborate if there were not enough slaves available, or if skills that could only be obtained through paid labor were required. Because the work in the agricultural sector was seasonal, this type of mix of labor was especially common. At harvest time, paid labor was brought in to supplement the slave staff, because it was not financially feasible to keep such a large workforce year-round. Slaves were employed by private individuals or the state. They were utilized in a variety of settings, including the private home, the construction industry, road building projects, public baths, agriculture, the manufacturing industries, transportation, education, the military, the service industries, education, and even to perform tasks in a certain cult ritual. As a nurse or personal attendant to her mistress was the highest status that a female slave could achieve. Perhaps because they desired complete independence from their children, Roman mothers were completely opposed to child rearing. Because they were typically housed in barrack buildings in poor, prison-like conditions and frequently kept in chains, agricultural slaves' lot was probably one of the worst. Work gangs that were chained together in life and death have been shown in Pompeii. Chronic arthritis and limb distortion found in other Pompeian skeletal remains cannot have been caused by extreme overwork or malnutrition. The celebrity slaves of ancient Roman Empire. Gladiators. It may be easy to forget that the majority of gladiators were also slaves, because they were at the center of public celebration and entertainment. If they met the physical requirements, prisoners of war and convicted criminals were frequently forced to become gladiators. These men then lived and trained at a combat school under the direction of a specialized instructor, frequently an ex-gladiator. Although it is a myth that a gladiator died in every fight, many fought to the death in amphitheaters in front of huge crowds. Gladiators were highly valuable commodities and frequently escaped death due to their popularity among the crowd. A description of gladiators as the glamorous representatives of slavery in ancient Rome might be too extreme. However, there were a few who rose to prominence and lived their lives in the spotlight. According to ancient sources, some women adored gladiators. Even outside of amphitheaters, small jars of sand that had been soaked in their sweat were sold as an aphrodisiac. Female slaves and their sexual availability. Sexual availability is an essential aspect of the female slave life. Although this applies to both male and female slaves, there are numerous other references to the use of female slaves. A master had complete sexual authority over his slaves regardless of their marital status. Not only did the master have sexual rights over his slaves, but also anyone the master gave permission to, including friends and family. Cato the censor even made an in-home brothel by charging his male slaves for having sex with his female slaves. It was common knowledge that prominent Roman figures like Scipio Africanus, Emperor Augustus, and Emperor Claudius had female slave lovers due to the widespread acceptance of this sexual availability. A prominent politician named Appius Claudius attempted to have his way with a freeborn woman at the beginning of the Roman Republic by claiming that she was nothing more than a slave. The fact that sexually abusing another person's slave was considered an illegal use of another person's property rather than a crime demonstrates the Roman attitude towards slaves. Throughout the late Republic and early Empire, Roman society relied heavily on the use of female slaves. They were typically the voice that the children first learned to imitate and fed the Roman infants every day from their own breasts. As private slaves or sex workers, they were also a fairly common means of sexual release for Roman men. The female slave helped keep the homegrown tranquility of Rome. Was getting freed possible? In ancient Rome, a procedure known as manumission was required in order to grant a person freedom from slavery. Manumission could be done in a number of ways. One of the most well-known was through a service held before a judge. The slave would be struck on the shoulder with a rod while kneeling before the magistrate in this location. The pileus, a soft conical hat that symbolized their freedom, would then be given to them. Additionally, many slaves were released against their master's wishes. Others were granted permission to officially register as citizens after their masters simply declared them free. Marriage to their masters was another option for freeing slave women. Typically, this was done so that any subsequent children could become free citizens. Last but not least, there were those who freed themselves from slavery by purchasing their own freedom. Even after the manumissions, slaves did not just become normal citizens of Rome. Instead, they would become conditional citizens. Slaves who were under the age of 30 were unfortunate enough not to be eligible to be freed. It was not possible for slaves under the age of 30 to get freedom until the 1st century. Most famous slave rebellions in history. Some evidence suggests that slaves were treated better during the imperial period because there were fewer wars, which reduced the supply of slaves and increased their value. It was also recognized that harsh treatment was counterproductive, so there were even laws that prohibited owners from being overly cruel. However, in practice, one can imagine that owners were free to treat their property however they saw fit. The only real constraint was the desire to preserve the asset's value and avoid provoking a drastic and collective response from those enslaved. In fact, treatises were written to advise on the best ways to manage slaves, including the best food and clothing, the prime ways to motivate them, like giving them time off or better food rations, and how to divide slaves up so that they wouldn't form dangerous protest groups. Slaves could turn against their masters if these careful plans and strategies didn't work every time. While Eunice's revolt in Sicily in 135 BCE and Spartacus's revolt in southern Italy in 73 BCE are arguably the most well-known examples of such uprisings, slaves were also able to demonstrate their dissatisfaction with their conditions by working more slowly, stealing, truancy, and sabotage. We do not have any records from the perspective of slaves themselves, but it is not difficult to imagine that, given the personal risks they faced, and the relationships they might have formed, slaves had little choice but to hope that one day they would be legitimately freed. Thus, Spartacus's case was remarkable, despite being unusual. It was not an attempt to overthrow slavery as a whole. Rather, it was the actions of a group of dissatisfied individuals willing to risk their lives to fight for their own freedom. Spartacus was a Thracian gladiator who was a Roman soldier. He led a slave rebellion that started at the Capua Gladiator School. An army of between 70,000 and 120,000 people was formed by adding slaves from the surrounding countryside and some free laborers. Amazingly, in 73 BCE, the slave army defeated 2 Roman armies in succession. Then in 72 BCE, Spartacus fought his way to Cisalpine Gaul and defeated both consuls. At this point, Spartacus may have intended to disperse, but his commanders preferred to continue wreaking havoc on Italy. So, he once more moved south. Marcus Licinius Crassus, at long last, squashed the rebellion at Lucania in 71 BCE. Spartacus was defeated in the battle, and the survivors, 6,000 of them, were executed to send a clear message to all Roman slaves that fighting for freedom was pointless. The social system of ancient Rome was heavily based on oppressing and exploiting one part of the population to benefit the other. Slaves of the ancient Roman Empire were treated like property or animals. If they received any good treatment, it was only for the reason of preserving the asset for future sale. Some slaves enjoyed a higher status and decent jobs than others, but being a slave in itself is terrifying. Knowing that someone owns you and you can never change it is enough to haunt you. If you're a history fanatic like us, don't forget to like this video and watch this video right here, which you will love as well for sure.